Okay, great. And okay, I think it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Chloe Fairbanks, who is a PhD student at the Faculty of English at the University of Oxford. Her research reconsiders Shakespeare's participation in early modern nation-making through the lens of eco-criticism and spatial thinking, and looking especially at the role of land in emerging conceptions of national identity in England. This evening, she'll be looking more specifically at diet in Shakespeare with a paper entitled The Heart and Stomach of England, Falstaffs Ambiguous Stomach. So it sounds really exciting. Thank you so much for being here, Chloe. Over to you.
Thank you. Quick preface, if you hear screaming in the background, it's a neighborhood children. We suspect them of having gone slightly feral. They were chasing each other with sticks yesterday. So don't be alarmed if you hear that in the background. I will endeavor to speak over them. I also want to caveat this with the fact that I am, as noted, an English student sort of moonlighting as a historian right now. So please forgive / alert me to any potential inaccuracies that come up in the course of this. In an effort to fortify English spirits against the Spanish Armada in 1588, Queen Elizabeth I turned to her stomach. In what has since become one of the most famous speeches attributed to her, she proclaimed, "I know I have the body, of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." To a modern reader, her choice of the digestive cavity as a signifier of her English kingship may seem somewhat unorthodox, but the early moderns would not necessarily have found it so. The word stomach carried a multitude of meanings in early modern English. Among them, it's used to signify the heart, or the inward seat of passion, emotion, secret thoughts, affections, or feelings. Given the context of her speech, Elizabeth may well have intended to use the term in this sense, or in its more figurative meaning as the appetite for something immaterial, as when in Henry V, the king speaks of having stomach to this fight. Yet, whether intentionally or not, Elizabeth's words also draw an implicit connection between her identity not only as a monarch, but as a specifically English monarch and the digestive cavity. Nor would such a connection necessarily have seemed out of place, given the vast body of both ancient and early modern literature, which held that one's characteristics were directly related to one's dietary regime. The works of Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen, among others, were still enormously influential, and their racial theories found their way into a variety of early modern texts, from cookery books to physiological texts, such as Levinus Lemnius's The Touchstone of Complexions, and Juan Huarte's The Examination of Men's Wits, published in English in 1576 and 1594, respectively. Galenic thinking held that one's humoral balance could, and indeed often should, be modified by the composition of one's diet. This philosophy was shared by early modern culinary texts, among them Thomas Eliot's The Castle of Health, which was in its 16th edition by 1595, and Henry Butts's Diet's Dry Dinner, published 1599. Likewise, early modern anatomical thinking divided the process of digestion into 3 stages, only one of which took place in the stomach itself. The others occurred in the liver, and then more broadly across the body as blood flowed through it. As David Hillman Carlamazia notes, the human body is from this perspective just a giant stomach. On one level, then, identity could be seen as directly dependent upon the stomach. Thus understood, one's choice of diet, for those who had the luxury of choice, could be seen as an act of self-fashioning. One's character was being formed through one's culinary choices, and people were, quite literally, what they ate. As Elizabeth's quote suggests, then, in the early modern period, food was seen as a quasi-authentic marker of identity, and the relationship between climatic and dietary theories rendered that identity similarly a matter of one's nationality. Lemnius asserted that the diversity of spirits and the difference of wits and manners proceedeth of the condition and nature of the place, air, country, and nourishment, drawing a connection directly between national identity, land, and consumption. But Elizabeth's words operate on multiple levels. Her stomach defines her first as a king, and then a king of England, indicating that food signifies her identity both in terms of her nationality and her social class. As queen, Elizabeth's diet, however English, would have been substantially different from that of the troops to whom her words were addressed. This distinction would have particular resonance over the next decade, during which the Stratford alderman Abraham Sturley would write to his fellow townsman Richard Quiney that our neighbours are growing with the wants of corn, or with the wants they feel through the dearness of corn, which here is beyond all other countries that I can hear of. These wants that Sturley spoke of were the result of what historians now call the Little Ice Age, which was a particularly cold period between approximately 1560 and 1720 that was bookended by two frigid, decade-scale climatic regimes. Among its other consequences, the Little Ice Age resulted in a series of poor harvests which swept the nation of England between 1586 and 1597, sending corn prices, skyrocketing across Europe. Some of Sturley's neighbors were luckier than others. William Shakespeare, whose signature is pictured here, was listed in the 1598 Note of Corn and Malt as possessing 10 quarters of malt, and at nearly 80 bushels, this was far more than one family might be expected to need, suggesting that the bard may have been among those Sturley later singled out for hoarding. Although in 1587, William Harrison had confidently been able to assert that our tables are oftentimes more plentifully garnished than those of other nations, the lived reality for many of Shakespeare's contemporaries, and indeed his audiences, was often quite the opposite. In fact, by the time the Note of Corn and Malt was issued, the average yeoman would have been more likely to lament alongside Jack Cade that famine and no other hath slain me, than he would be to praise the plenitude of his table. If, as implied in Elizabeth's figuration, to be English was to identify oneself with particularly English acts of consumption, then the famines of 1586 to 97 posed a serious threat not only to the nation's mortality rates, but to its very identity. Nor were environmental factors the only challenges facing the oft-asserted connection between eating and identity in this period. Many of the foodstuffs commonly associated with the English were themselves of dubious national provenance and/or popularity. In Henry V, for example, the French echo the common belief that beef of all flesh is most usual among Englishmen, when they assume that their foes require great meals of beef. But a brief survey of contemporary cookbooks and dietary manuals, such as Dawson's Good Hussif's Jewel, published 1585, or the anonymous Good Hussif's Handmaid for the Kitchen, 1594, suggests that mutton or lamb was significantly more common. The Good Hussif's Handmaid for the Kitchen contains 3 times as many recipes for mutton as for beef, while Dawson's cookbook omits it entirely. It's worth noting here that both the prominence and profitability of sheep farming rose over that of cattle during this period. By 1601, for example, it's estimated that sheep outnumbered people in England perhaps by as many as 3 to 1, suggesting that this choice of mutton or lamb might have simply been one of practicality. But equally ambiguous are the foodstuffs consumed by Shakespeare's Falstaff, a character who is often seen as quintessentially English. Over the course of the 2 Henry IV plays, the Fat Knight consumes or discusses consuming the following items: sack, capons, egg and butter, Madeira, sauce, anchovies, bread, sugar candy, apples, and wine. Barbara Seebeck has demonstrated the fraught politics of sack, which was imported from Spain and the Canary Islands, and wine was likewise a continental import. Even the capon and the anchovy, both regular staples of the English diet, were of likely European origin. Falstaff's stomach, then, is anything but unambiguously English. However, in many ways, Falstaff embodies the idea of English consumption discussed above, even to the point of excess. Joan Fitzpatrick has noted that although Sir John eats the kind of foodstuff that would be familiar to most playgoers, bread, capon, sack, he does so in quantities that set him apart from the majority. He is, at one and the same time, both familiar and extreme. This paper will suggest that it is precisely this extremity which allows Shakespeare to expose the fragility of notions of identity grounded in food and drink. Falstaff is quite literally larger than life. Although in many ways he exemplifies English stereotypes of consumption, the substances he consumes, and the quantity in which he does so, renders him a stranger. Perhaps this accounts for the initial emphasis the authors of Sir John Oldcastle place on the titular character's dietary habits, which are often conflated with his moral qualities. The prologue, for example, is quick to assure its audience that it is no pampered glutton we present, nor aged counselor to youthful sins, but one whose virtue shone above the rest, a valiant martyr and a virtuous peer, in whose true faith and loyalty expressed, unto his sovereign and his country's weal. Oldcastle's dedication here to his country's weal, or good, is framed in contrast not only to Falstaff's sinful influence on Prince Hal, but also to his diet. Pampered could at this time refer specifically to someone who was overfed, investing the comparison with extra weight, if you'll pardon the pun. When considered in light of Falstaff's dubious stomach, then, Oldcastle seems to place particular emphasis on the relationship between the former's dietary habits and his lack of regard for the nation's well-being. Oldcastle, meanwhile, is himself figured as a source of national nourishment later in the play. he is referred to as a brave lord that keeps good beef, and every day feeds 100 poor people at his gate. It can hardly be irrelevant, then, that Falstaff's own military ineffectuality is repeatedly associated with his diet, particularly in Henry IV, Part 1, Act 4, Scene 2, and Henry IV, Part 1, Act 5, Scene 3. So by drawing this distinction between the gluttonous Falstaff and the loyal Oldcastle who is devoted to his country's weal, the latter play may also be implying that national loyalty is incompatible with an overly international diet. After all, the play is widely agreed to act as an attempt to rehabilitate an English national hero. Given the close connection between identity and diet in this period, then, it is not inconceivable that this attempt should begin by distancing the historical Oldcastle from his overfed Shakespearean counterpart. Now, there's of course nothing particularly groundbreaking in observing that Falstaff is repeatedly associated with consumption throughout both parts of Henry IV. Like Elizabeth, the fat knight's identity is defined by his stomach. He is commonly addressed as, among other things, "You fat-kidneyed rascal, you fat guts, you whoreson round man, thou whoreson obscene greasy tallow catch, and even thou clay-brained guts," which, although not necessarily suggestive of his girth, does allude to the practice of baking poultry and pie in clay during this period. Falstaff's stomach is therefore potentially at once the site of food preparation and consumption. Often, in fact, no further identification is necessary, for to speak to Falstaff's stomach is to speak to the man himself. His location is likewise related to food. When seeking the knight in Part 2 of Henry IV, Hal asks not, "Where is he?" but "Where sups he?" Falstaff's habitual retreat to a tavern in Eastcheap thus adds a particularly local dimension to the relationship between identity and consumption. This slide bears very little actual relevance to the presentation, but I wanted some shot of a tavern interior scene, and I really enjoy Simon Russell Beale and Tom Hiddleston, so please enjoy that while I continue talking. Eastcheap was historically associated with food, giving a precedent for the tavern scenes in Henry IV, Part 1, and the famous victories of Henry V. But John Stowe is clear that there was no tavern then, i.e. Falstaff's time, in Eastcheap. This may therefore be a deliberate alteration on Shakespeare's part, offering a contemporary detail, like Prince Hal's fondness for small beer, for his Elizabethan audience's understanding. However, while substantial critical attention has been paid to Falstaff as both an eater and a drinker, there has yet to be a sustained study of the knight as a figure whose patterns of consumption render him more foreign than native. Criticism has traditionally regarded the fat knight as having special access to something deeply and immemorially English, to quote Michael Dobson in a recent London Review of Books article. Critics such as Joshua Fisher have suggested that Falstaff can be understood as embodying overwhelmingly native English foodstuffs. But while Fisher correctly identifies many of the substances Falstaff consumes as being increasingly associated with the indigenous English diet in the 16th and 17th centuries, he pays insufficient attention to the problematic nature of that association, as well as seeming to treat the substances in question relatively equally. Fisher lists Falstaff's diet with little attention to the frequency with which certain items appear. He lists regional puddings, for example, which appear once as a descriptor, not even an item consumed, in the same breath as butter, which appears 5 times. Butter was strongly associated with the Dutch during this period, and nowhere more so than in theatrical stereotypes of that nation. The excessive consumption of butter, moreover, was particularly linked with the Dutch. Engerboord's Dietary of Health notes that Dutch men doth eat it, butter, at all times in the day. That Falstaff both eats and is, quote, as fat as butter, then arguably forges a stronger conceptual connection between the knight and the Low Countries than it does with the knight and his native land. And even within England, butter was associated more with labourers than with the titled classes. Equally problematic was the perception that excessive consumption of butter, which Falstaff's, I would say, certainly qualifies as, weakened the stomach. So Falstaff's consumption of it connects him not only to the wrong hierarchic identity, but suggests that the quantities in which he is consuming it weaken his stomach, making it potentially more susceptible to dangers such as foreign influence. As Hillman and Mazzio have noted, the porousness of the stomach is symptomatic often of the overall porousness of the individual. A weakened stomach thus suggests the possibility of a weakened identity. That Falstaff's connection to butter should be alluded to 4 times as often as his purported connection to regional puddings, then, suggests that it may even have been his Dutchness, or perhaps his susceptibility to Dutch influences, and not his Englishness, which was foremost in the audience's mind. This connection is strengthened by the character's origins in the Lollard martyr Sir John Oldcastle. Oldcastle was English, but the label Lollard was drawn from Middle Dutch, and the Dutch Lollards preceded their English counterparts by nearly a century. So while Falstaff may be nominally English, his stomach is in fact anything but. By far the most prominent instance, both of consumption and of Falstaff's problematic Englishness, appears in the form of sack, with which he is associated from his first moment on stage. Throughout both plays, Falstaff's repeated refrain is "Give me a cup of sack," which he either calls for or references approximately 21 times in Henry IV Part 1, and a further 7 times in Henry IV Part 2, both far more than he mentions or is associated with any other food or beverage. As previously noted, Barbara Seebeck and Joan Fitzpatrick, among others, have pointed out that sack was a fortified wine, imported from Spain and the Canary Islands, and while attempts were made to English the beverage, such as the addition of sugar, sack nevertheless remained profoundly implicated in Anglo-Spanish relations. Falstaff himself points to the ongoing foreignness of the beverage when he reproaches Francis, "You rogue, here's lime in this sack." We know from Richard Hawkins that since the Spanish sacks have been common in our taverns, which for conservation is mingled with lime in its making, our nation complaineth of diseases not heard of before this wine came into frequent use. And as you can see, the picture on this page is a painting of Falstaff drinking sack. Falstaff is so profoundly associated with sack that when you look up sack on Wikipedia, this lovely image of him drinking it is what appears, rather than a picture of the sack itself. So Falstaff's beverage is thus identified as both problematically not English and as a source of potential infection. Prince Hal heightens the latter sense with his early dismissal of his Eastcheap companions as base contagious clouds, echoing the association between foreign consumables and contamination indicated by Hawkins and, elsewhere in Shakespeare's plays, John Lincoln. Equally problematic is the fact that sack was technically an illegal import from the years 1585 to 1604, making its presence in the plays, like that of Hal's small beer, anachronistic, and further locating the texts firmly in the Elizabethan present rather than the Henrician past. Perhaps most troubling was the adoption of foreign nationalities by English traders as a way of bypassing this trade ban. So Falstaff's addiction to sack is prefiguring the language of contamination used to describe the foreigners and their strange roots in plays like Thomas More, suggesting that the knight's English identity has been gradually eroded by his ingestion of this foreign beverage. The association between Falstaff and the foreign yet English sack is in fact so pronounced that his body becomes synonymous with the containers in which it is transported. In the mock interview in Part 1, Hal refers to Falstaff as a ton of man and a huge bombard of sack. Both ton and bombard were containers for holding wine, itself, as noted, not actually a native English beverage. And sack is, of course, a fortified wine too. Hal heightens this sense of Falstaff as a vessel when he describes him as a stuffed cloak bag or suitcase of guts. The term is suggestive not only of travel, but of foreign foods being contained within these guts. However English Falstaff's body may originally have been then, it has become bloated by consumption, reduced to a mere receptacle for foreign comestibles. Hal seems to tacitly acknowledge the serious implications of this for Falstaff's national identity, including in his list of epithets the phrase, "that trunk of humorous." His words remind the audience that before Falstaff's body became a huge bombard of sack, it was inhabited by its original humors, the bodily fluids held to determine one's identity. As a native-born Englishman, Falstaff's humors ought to have inclined him towards local foodstuffs, but his increasing reliance upon foreign beverages threatens to alter this. In fact, if you check the title page for the 1598 quarto of Henry IV Part 1, it notes its inclusion of, and I quote, "the humorous conceits of Sir John Falstaff." The 21st century reader might be inclined to interpret humorous as comical, but it's worth noting that the OED's first recorded use of humorous in that sense does not occur until approximately 1652. Obviously, that's not to say that the title page in 1598 couldn't have been an early use of the word in this sense. Shakespeare was known for doing such things, but it does raise the possibility that its relations to character and physiology could have been the more common definition at this time. Falstaff's humors and their effect on his characters and pattern of consumption could thus have been suggested as a focus from the title page onwards. That these humorous epithets appear in the scene where Hal first explicitly repudiates Falstaff is itself significant. When Hal instructs Falstaff to stand for my father, he draws an implicit connection between Falstaff's fat guts and Englishness, for in playing the part of King Henry, Falstaff represents both the body personal and the body politic. If King Henry IV is England, Falstaff here counterfeits, however temporarily, the person of England. This has troubling implications for national identity and, even more so, for national security. The porous boundaries of Falstaff's body, infiltrated by, among other things, Spanish sack and Dutch butter, suddenly come to suggest England's own vulnerability to foreign invasion and influence. Henry IV's reign was fraught with the rebellions which make up much of the play's action, and as Act 3, Scene 1 of Part 1 show, concern over boundaries were deeply enmeshed in the civil discord sweeping the nation. Nor were such concerns limited to the play's setting. At the time of its first performances, peace with Spain was still nearly a decade away, and the Spanish threat remained a very real source of anxiety. The Third Spanish Armada took place in 1597, sparking widespread panic about defending English coastlines, and Spain would make one further attempt in 1601, 3 years before the peace was signed. Here we have another irreverent moment. This is Ben Wilbond as King Philip II of Spain in Bill the Film by the Horrible Histories Crowd. I would highly recommend it to anyone, and I'm just going to leave it here while I continue to talk about Anglo-Spanish relations. So Falstaff's Anglo-Spanish stomach is raising troubling implications for the nation, particularly given his potential influence over its heir, whom he will portray later in the same scene. When Falstaff says, "Banish plump Jack and banish all the world," there's a sense in which he means it quite literally, as both he and his stomach are persistently associated with that which is foreign made domestic throughout both plays. In Part 2, Hal will even address his companion as "thou globe of sinful continents," drawing a direct connection between the wider world and Falstaff's degeneracy. The knight himself seems almost proud of this connection, bragging, "I have a whole school of tongues in this belly of mine." And the pun on tongue is at once linguistic and consumable, i.e. neat's tongue, or a common early modern term for calf or beef tongue. This draws a further connection between Falstaff's patterns of consumption and the wider world. And that his stomach is so big as to contain not one but many languages is suggestive of the extent to which his identity has become, like the wine it contains, complexly implicated in global systems of production and trade. The illusion is strengthened a few lines later with the relation of that same stomach to Europe, which was itself a semi-common association at the time. It was not unheard of for maps such as these pictured to sort of anthropomorphize various continents. And so the relationship between the physical body and different parts of the body and land was sort of semi-widespread in the cultural consciousness. As one who seems almost to revel in his foreign consumption, with little regard for its effect upon his native soil, Falstaff thus seems increasingly unsuitable as a companion for the young prince. Hal seems to recognize this, first insisting that he and Falstaff exchange roles, and then using the role of his father to question the knight's character. Wherein is he good, Hal as Henry asks, but to taste sack and drink it? Ultimately, then, it seems that Hal's reliance on Falstaff must end, because the knight exemplifies the dangerous and insidious potential for foreign influence over an English monarch. Fisher argues that in rejecting Falstaff, the newly crowned Henry V has defined himself in contrast to an English body composed of diverse regional identities and flavors. This paper suggests the opposite. Throughout the plays, Hal repeatedly demonstrates a chameleon-like ability to fit in as easily in Eastcheap as he does in court, able, as he says, to drink with any tinker in his own language. Unlike Falstaff, however, Hal does not appear to be dominated by this consumption. It's true that he tells Poins of his drinks with the drawers, and earlier asserts that he will sup in Eastcheap, but these moments do not receive the sustained attention given to Falstaff's own eating and drinking. They appear as moments in the prince's day, rather than that which it revolves around. Far from rejecting a diverse English body, then, Hal is able to put its various guises on and off at will, and in rejecting Falstaff, he defines himself in contrast not to regional flavors, but to an excessive reliance upon international ones. In doing so, he asserts an identity implicated in, but not overly reliant upon, international imports. I find myself hilarious. I do apologize if you do not enjoy these memes. It's also worth noting, I think, that many of the derogatory comments made about Falstaff's stomach and indeed his diet originate with Hal. suggesting that even in the earliest scenes of Henry IV, Part 1, the prince is opposed on some level to an excessively foreign diet. Indeed, unlike Falstaff, he seems to possess a unique ability to domesticate that which is foreign. Even before their marriage and Henry V is certain, the French Princess Catherine insists that she must learn English in preparation for it. Hal's desire for small beer may likewise be read as an act of domestication. Studying Reginald Scott's perfect platform for a hop garden, Peter Perlin notes an emphasis on the ways in which local conditions, in this case the English soil, guaranteed the excellence of English beer. And here you can see some illustrations of English planters from Scott's perfect platform. This belief in the superiority of local conditions, which is itself in tune with early modern climactic thinking, allows for middle ground in tensions between foreign consumables and the English stomach. To consume beer from the Low Countries may be to risk, as Jean Baudin cautioned, being changed, but to consume beer produced entirely on English soil and entirely from English ingredients and recipes suggests an English triumph over the would-be foreign usurpers. Contemporary dietary literature seems to suggest as much. William Bullen praises clean brewed beer if it is not very strong, brewed with good hops, which cleanseth the body from corruption, whilst warning against beer made from foreign ingredients, many rotten hops, or hops dried like dust, which cometh from beyond the sea. Particular praise is extended to the country of Suffolk, whereas they brew their beer with the hops that groweth upon their own grounds. So Bullen's juxtaposition with good hops that groweth upon their own grounds, with those rotten hops which cometh from beyond the sea, creates a distinction between the original beverage and its domesticated offspring. The beverage may once have been foreign, but this is circumvented by brewing it locally and doing so from entirely local ingredients. Unlike Falstaff's sack, nothing remains to corrupt the English body. The linguistic association between corruption and contamination and foreigners, be they human or consumable, was itself common in Shakespeare's lifetime. The year the playwright died also saw the publication of John Deacon's Tobacco Tortured, in which the author derides, and this is quite a long quote, so forgive me if I have to take breaths, England's careless intercourse with trafficking with the courageous corruptions and customs of foreign nations, from whence cometh it is now to pass that so many of our Englishmen's minds are thus terribly Turkished with Mahometan trumperies, thus ruefully Romanized with superstitious relics, thus treacherously Italianized with sundry anti-Christian toys, thus spitefully Spanished with superfluous pride, thus fearfully Frenchized with filthy prostitutions, and it goes on and on. So, in both his choice of beverage and of bride, Hal is demonstrating, in fact, the power of the English over their foreign adversaries, as opposed to what Deacon is ranting about. Hal is, in fact, domesticating both in his foundation of a nationally hybrid dynasty. That this requires both demonstration and domestication, however, suggests that the perception of diet as a signifier of national identity is perhaps less stable than it might initially appear. Throughout the history plays, Shakespeare's engagement with early modern dietary theories raises such questions about the reliability of notions of identity grounded in consumption. As work by Felicity Heal and David Goldstein, among others, has demonstrated, eating and drinking were deeply embedded in the idea of commensality. This is exemplified both in the ideas of reciprocity and community that have been found by Wendy Wall and others in early modern recipe books, as well as in a text like Butts's Diet's Dry Dinner, which includes stories for table talk throughout the book to encourage conversation at the dining table. One's diet is therefore understood to inform one's identity in more ways than one. The act of consumption is framed as a typically social one, creating or reinforcing community bonds, while what one consumes forges a further connection between oneself and the land one calls home, which is where, ideally, what one is consuming is produced. But in Shakespeare's histories, and indeed in several of his tragedies, Titus Andronicus springs to mind, as does Timon of Athens, food often appears to do quite the opposite. Much attention has been paid to the role of feasting and banqueting in the plays, but looking much more closely at the particular food and drink on offer, I think can shed valuable light on their problematic status as signifiers of identity. By studying these texts alongside not only early modern dietary literature, but the agricultural conditions under which they were composed, we can illuminate our understanding both of particular scenes and of broader tensions between dietary theory and practice. In doing so, we can begin to see how those tensions played out for men and women in multiple social spheres and regions of England. In the process, it becomes evident that despite prevailing assumptions regarding the connection between the two, diet is perhaps ultimately an unstable and porous signifier of national identity, complicated both by regionality and social standing, and by the prevalence of imported food and drink in early modern English society. Thank you very much.